Hey everyone, I'm Alex and this is Big Out Books. Today I'm doing part 2 of my June reading wrap-up. So if you saw part 1, you know that I have just been reading books by Indigenous female authors this month. I talked about 7 books in my first video, and in my video today I'm going to be talking about 9 books, which is pretty good. I made it through my whole TBR of 15 books, plus snuck in a little bonus one. Technically, I finished these books on the 3rd day of July, so it crept out a little bit out of June, but I'm still really happy with all the books I was able to read this month. So like in the last video, I'm going to do this in order of favorite to least favorite, so you can know right away what all the best stuff is from this excellent collection of books. So let's get going. When it comes down to it, I think the best book that I read this month was Ceremony by Marmon Silko. It is just a dense and powerful novel. It's about an army veteran named Teo who was fighting overseas, and then he has come home. He lives on the Laguna Pueblo reservation, and he is all kinds of messed up from his war experience. And this is also the reservation where Marmon Silko herself grew up, so you can tell that she clearly has a very intimate sense of place because the way that she writes about this part of the world is just phenomenal. She uses so much imagery that your senses feel so involved reading her prose, and you just really feel like you're there, for better or for worse, because a lot of times this book is describing some really intense, emotional, dark places. At the start of this book, Teo is just not able to function at all. He is so messed up with what he's going through. He is vomiting all the time. He is having these terrible dreams. He's not able to sleep properly. He has a lot of survivor's guilt, and he's also having a hard time adjusting back into U.S. society. When he was a member of the army, he felt somewhat respected, but now that he's come home, there is no sort of respect anymore. He is kind of just back to being stereotyped as a poor Indian, and he's having a hard time dealing with that transition. As you can guess from the title, Teo tries to go through a ceremony so that he can begin to heal himself. So he has to go through these intense experiences that hopefully he will come back on the other side as a more healed and put together person. But it's very high stakes all the way through this book. He does meet up with an Indigenous healer, and I really liked this character because he is acknowledging that while tradition is important to a lot of Indigenous nations, it can't be the only thing that guides them going forward. And you can't just try to recreate the ceremonies of the past. Rather, they need to continue to be reinvented so that they can still be relevant and helpful for people living in a modern society. What's cool about this book is at first you think the World War was the big cataclysmic event that has gone on, but what you realize is Teo has much larger battles to fight at home, and the war was just really getting him ready for those deeper battles, especially as he has to discover himself. He's got a lot of internal conflicts, but also he has to be able to protect his own Indigenous culture in a dominant society that is trying to eradicate his culture. So that was a really fascinating take on this story. I really enjoyed this book. It could be a little slow going at times since Silko is a very descriptive writer, so sometimes you get a lot more detail than you do plot, but it's a really rewarding character study. And it's definitely more of an approachable place to start reading Marmon Silko than her other famous novel, Almanac of the Dead. This one is a lot longer, a lot crazier and more difficult to get into. However, I think this one still may be slightly my favorite of her books, but however, both of them were truly excellent. The next book I have to talk about is a nonfiction book that really blew my mind. This one's called As We Have Always Done: Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. Now, she is a truly incredible author from the Alderville First Nation, and she writes a lot of creative stuff. She does poetry, music, short fiction, but she's also an academic and a brilliant nonfiction writer as well. So she has this academic background, she teaches in universities, she's clearly a brilliant thinker, and she can unpack these complex theories, but she's also informed by her Mishi Sagig Nishnabeg ways of knowing and her ways of presenting information. So her writing can feel very original and maybe a little disorienting if you've only been used to linear Western styles of thinking. So this is a very uncompromising and highly original book looking at the topic of radical resurgence. So think of things that you've seen in the media of Indigenous people coming together to fight some injustices such as the Dakota Access Pipeline, all the big protests that were happening there. Or you can think of the Idle No More movement in Canada that was flaring up all over the country. And basically she is grounding these episodes in more history and context. So basically her stance is that to be Indigenous in Canada and the US is basically an act of resistance, because they're sort of cultures that are trying to dispossess Indigenous people of the land and eradicate their culture. This can be an uncomfortable truth, and Leanne can be very blunt, but what she's saying is the fact that there are still Indigenous people around today practicing their way of life is an amazing testament to the resilience that is inherent in these cultures. What she does in this book is tries to imagine a future where people can live in some kind of alternate space where they sort of opt out of the colonial reality, which is a really out there concept. The idea that you can just kind of say, no thanks, I don't want to be a part of this, and then try to imagine an alternate future that is sort of happening in the present, just where you're not participating in this kind of toxic way of life. It was so inspiring learning about Leanne's vision for the future, and she writes a lot about her own personal experience, how she became connected to her Mishi Sagig Nishnabeg culture, and how she has learned so much from interacting with the land, with traditional teachings, and with her language. So she really made those seem like the big priorities, not extra funding from the government, but just getting out there, being on the land, interacting with elders, and learning those original languages. So this is a really powerful book. I don't know if you'll always agree with everything that she suggests in here, but it is really eye-opening. And after reading this book, I went on to read another one of her collections of stories and songs called Islands of Decolonial Love. And I found that having that background from As We Have Always Done into who she is and what Nishnabeg culture is like, it was really helpful in getting myself into the stories in this collection. I don't think that I can accurately describe what these stories are like. You really just have to experience them for themselves. They're so original and not like anything else. But essentially, these are love stories that do take place almost in that imagined alternate future that Simpson describes in As We Have Always Done. They're not really set in the present as we know it, but it is almost some kind of radical reimagining of what life could be like, and they were really beautiful and touching. Next up, I have two poetry collections. They were both brilliant. I recommend both of them. The first one is Whereas by Layli Long Soldier. She is an Oglala Lakota poet, and oh my god, this collection, first of all, is just like really gorgeous. Like, they're big pages, expansive, like the prairies where she's writing. She gets into deep-rooted U.S. history where treaties went wrong with the Lakota people. Also, she touches on the pathetic apology in U.S. Congress that happened, but these poems are just beautiful, and they're also very formally inventive a lot of the times, so I just really liked watching Layli Long Soldier's brain working while she presented these poems. They were really incredible. I also really loved this collection, A Really Good Brown Girl by Marilyn Dumont. She's a Métis author, and these are poems that kind of seem simple on the page, but are just so rich in meaning. And she writes a lot about shame and self-acceptance, you know, what it's like growing up as someone that is perceived as different, and yet learning to embrace the strengths of her identity. It's a really cool collection. There are some cheeky poems in here. There's one that's mocking Sir Johnny MacDonald, kind of like, we're still here. And there's also a really beautiful poem in here that was about her father dying and how life moves on after death, and it's hard for us to accept that, but that it's really beautiful being able to leave our bodies. So this was a really awesome collection as well. The next book I have is a memoir called Life Among the Qallunaat by Minnie Aodla Freeman. She grew up in an Inuit community in James Bay and then ended up getting a few jobs where she had to move further down south into Ontario. And she writes this book kind of about how disorienting and strange that experience was. So the title is kind of making a joke. Usually, Life Among the Inuit, you know, you have one white person that comes up and writes about how strange their culture is. this, she is coming down to mainstream Canadian culture and kind of mirroring that society back and how strange it can all be. And she makes some very good observations in here. She spends a lot of time writing about her upbringing, so you do learn a lot about what it's like living in an Inuit family in that part of the world, including the painful experience of getting sent to residential school, where she experienced a lot of loneliness. And apparently that was part of the reason why this book was originally published in the 70s, and there was a lot of critical acclaim and interest in the book, and yet it wasn't getting distributed. And it turns out the Canadian government had bought a lot of copies and were just kind of storing them somewhere. So it was almost like they were afraid about what she was really going to say about the residential school experience. So this edition has actually been re-released by the First Voices First Text series. So I'm glad that there are publishers out there trying to get these authentic works out for people to learn a little bit more about other cultures in Canada. So it's a cool book. Minnie comes across as such a charming individual, and she writes in such a matter-of-fact style, but will give you some more insight in what it's like living in both the north and south of Canada. So if you're looking for a memoir from an Inuit perspective, this is a cool one to check out. The next novel I have to talk about is Sundogs by Maracle. Originally on my June TBR, I said that I would be reading Celia's Song, but then I found a copy of this at a used bookstore, which I was so excited about, and decided to read this one instead, since it is Maracle's debut novel. And it is a book that you can kind of tell is a debut. It's not the most artfully constructed novel that I've ever read, but it was still a pretty engaging tale. Sundogs is sort of a coming-of-age story about a girl named Leanne who is trying to make sense of the world around her. She is growing up in this large and kind of messy, dysfunctional family, and also there are these turbulent political events happening. This is set in the year 1990, so the two events that are referred to quite often in the text are the Elijah Harper blockade of the Meech Lake Accord, and the second one is what's referred to as the Oka Crisis, where basically developers were trying to build a golf course on a sacred Mohawk grave site. And the Mohawk people were not going to allow that to happen, so they stood up to the developers, and eventually the Canadian Army got called in. So it did become a pretty big conflict. But Leanne sees both of these events as incredibly empowering, where before she wasn't really proud of being an Indigenous person, but seeing these kind of triumphant moments, she is learning to accept who she is and to embrace her family, and it's a pretty powerful book in that way. She also has a bit of a love triangle going on with her boss at work and this white boy from her college classes, so that kind of also keeps the plot rolling along, but really it's not about the men in her life. It is more about her journey, learning to accept who she is and see her place in the world. So you can really see the personal and the political intersect in fascinating ways in this book. The last nonfiction book I have to talk about is called Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit by Batiste. This is a pretty good overview of the topic if you're interested in Canadian education and how it has kind of failed Indigenous students and how they failed to incorporate Indigenous content in the curriculum. But that was kind of my issue with this book, is that it did feel very much like an overview of the topic, where I'm kind of looking for more specific insights on how to do better as a Canadian teacher operating in this system. But still, this goes over kind of a lot of the legal and historic foundations for why things are the way that they are. I really enjoyed when Batiste would write about her own personal experience in revitalizing the Micmac schools in her community, so that was cool. But overall, this book wasn't the most exciting take on the topic, but again, good overview if you want to learn a little bit more about this topic. The last book I read this month wasn't on my June TBR, but I really wanted to try to read it since June is also Pride Month, and that is this slim little collection called Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time, an Indigenous Lgbt Sci-Fi Anthology. So the title pretty much explains it. That's what you get. These stories feature Indigenous LGBTQ protagonists and relationships that are set in some kind of future and sci-fi settings. So they're pretty enjoyable for the most part. I can't really say that any of the stories in this collection really blew me away, or that they are going to be super memorable short stories. I think that I maybe prefer Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's interpretation of sci-fi in that Indigenous culture and ways of thinking has never really been linear or straightforward, so stories that interweave the past, the present, and the future are kind of sci-fi in nature and really appropriate to Indigenous narratives. So you don't need to borrow from kind of traditional sci-fi stories of like being in space and time travel. There's really a kind of a more creative way you can operate in this genre that I felt maybe didn't happen so much in all of these stories, but still, a cool collection to check out if you're interested in the topic. So those are all of the books that I read this June. I really enjoyed taking on this project and just diving deep into this topic. I feel like I learned so much, actually, from reading all of these books. I just feel like I have a better sense of what it means to be an Indigenous woman today, which is really powerful, and it was an awesome learning experience for me coming from a settler perspective. So I'm so happy that I took the month to complete this project. If you haven't already, check out part 1 of my June wrap-up for even more fantastic books. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.